So now we have been discussing GCP. Height করে দিই। So this is the formal definition of GCP, and this definition which has been provided by a body called the International Conference on Harmonization, now called the International Council on Harmonization. It's actually a long name, International Council of Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Registration of Pharmaceuticals for Human Use. So if you look at this definition, you see the two aspects. It provides assurance that the data and reported results are credible and accurate, the science aspect, and that the rights, integrity, and confidentiality of the trial subjects are protected. This is the ethics aspect. So this definition was proposed by ICH in the 1990s, and the first formal GCP guidelines were released by ICH, which is a international body. Original founder members consisted of government representatives, drug regulatory authority representatives, and pharmaceutical industry representatives from 3 regions of the world, namely Japan, the European Union representing most of the countries in Western Europe, and United States of America. Subsequently, more members have been added to it. So this was the definition proposed by ICH, and we are following the definition till now. Now, do we have any Indian GCP guidelines? What do you think? If you search, let's say in Chrome, Google Chrome, Indian GCP guidelines, will you get something like that? But if you search ICH GCP guidelines, you'll be able to download a document called E6, ICH E6, which is the ICH GCP guidelines. So ICH sets guidelines on many aspects of drug development, and ICH E6 is the ICH GCP guidelines. But in India, we do not have one single document by the name of GCP guidelines. For a time we had at the turn of the millennium, but now there is no separate Indian GCP guidelines. But what we have is a set of guidelines, national guidelines for biomedical research involving human participants. These guidelines were first brought out in a rudimentary form by the Indian Council of Medical Research in 1980s. Subsequently, there has been revisions and expansions of these guidelines, and the version which ICMR brought out in 2006 was heralded as a sort of GCP guidelines for India. So this was a much expanded guidelines. It was used not only in India, but many developing countries of the world which did not have their own GCP guidelines as such, and which were following it difficult to follow Western guidelines. They started following the ICMR guidelines, and in that way, the guidelines have tremendous significance. Now, at about the same time, in 2005, the Indian drug regulator did something unique. What did they do? We have a Drugs and Cosmetics Act framed in 1940 and some drugs and cosmetic rules framed under the Act in 1945. So what in 2005, the CDSCO, what they did was they expanded the scope of Schedule Y, which is one of the appendices of the drugs and cosmetic rules. They expanded it to incorporate many of these things which guidelines speak about in doing clinical research, and they put it there. So revised Schedule Y guidelines. But what was unique about that? The drugs and cosmetic rules are not just guidelines, they are law. They are legally enforceable. So what used to be guidelines for the rest of the world, in India, they became also law. Now, guidelines still have a optional element about them. You may choose to follow guidelines or not follow guidelines, but you cannot choose to follow law or not follow law. You have to follow the law of the land. And if you're not following it, you'll be doing something illegal and you'll be open to punishment under appropriate legal provisions. So for a time, this dichotomy persisted because some of the elements in Schedule Y did not tally with the guidelines given in the ICMR document. But by and large, the spirit was the same, so we were managing. And then in 2009, what our drug regulator did, they repealed Schedule Y. So earlier Schedule Y was done away with, and on March 19, 2019, they came up with new drugs and clinical trial rules. So that was Gazette notified. So new law we have. This specifically deals with new drugs and clinical trials. And one of the advantage of this new revision was that much of the discrepancy between the guidelines as proposed by ICMR and the law as proposed in Schedule Y, these discrepancies have largely been ironed out. There are still some gray areas, and some of the areas are separately covered. But by and large, now the law and the guidelines are saying the same thing. So if you follow, you'll be following the both. And for everyone doing clinical research in India, you are supposed to be acquainted with and follow the ICMR guidelines as well as new drugs and clinical trial rules. And they together comprise Indian GCP. So we do not have any single Indian GCP guidelines as such. So Indian GCP means now the ICMR guidelines and the new drugs and clinical trial rules of 2019. Okay. And I think Balaram has just placed this book, New Drugs and Clinical Trial Rules. Okay. So first we'll look at what the ICMR guidelines say. Okay. 2006, there was a revised ICMR guidelines. The last major revision of the ICMR guidelines has been in 2017. And in 2017, ICMR has actually come up with two guidelines. One is the general guidelines and one is a guideline specifically for biomedical research involving children. Okay. So that was in October 2017. So anyone doing clinical research in India, not trials alone, any kind of clinical research, new drugs and clinical trial rules are covering only clinical trials, but all other kinds of clinical research and clinical trials are covered by ICMR guidelines. So they're relatively voluminous book, and ICMR realized that not many people are going to read these voluminous books. So what they did in 2018, they brought out a handbook. So summary of the guidelines, this is much more easily manageable, 22 page. Okay. It's like an executive summary of the guidelines, and my request to all of you is that please go through this handbook. You can download it anytime you want, and they give, in essence, they give all the information that we are speaking about in the different session. Role of investigator, sponsor, ethics committees, informed consent, safety issues like this. ICMR has brought out other guidelines helpful in the process of research, like in 2019, policy on research integrity and publication ethics, and the very latest this year, ethical guidelines for application of artificial intelligence in biomedical research and healthcare. I have to admit, I have not gone through these guidelines myself. They are relatively new, but this is somewhat, they are making themselves future proof, because artificial intelligence, machine learning is going to impact the field of clinical research in a big way. It is anticipated. So what does these ICMR guidelines, what are their core issues? So there are 12 areas of themes which the ICMR guidelines address. They begin with general principles, then the fundamental tenets of ethics, what is meant by responsible conduct of research, ethical review procedures. Basically, this deals with the roles and responsibilities of the ethics committees, the informed consent process. You must remember that informed consent is not just signing a form. It has three components. Okay. Giving information, making sure that the information has been understood, and three, documenting consent. So there are three elements to the whole thing. It's a process. Then vulnerability, which is given a special focus. I'll speak briefly about them. Some special issues related to clinical trials, special issues related to public health research, special issues related to social and behavioral sciences related research, special issues related to genetic research, and a new element which was not there in the earlier guidelines about biobanking. That means preserving human tissue samples, genetic information, medical records, body parts, etc. for future research, and then research during humanitarian emergencies and disasters. So we'll briefly look at some of these elements. Now, Dr. Shaptarshi, if you remember, he showed you a diagram showing that the fundamental ethical pillars of research. What were these? Autonomy, beneficence, non-beneficence, justice, and capping it all, honesty and dignity. Respect for dignity is confidentiality, respecting the confidentiality of the participants. So these four fundamental tenets, beneficence, justice, autonomy, non-beneficence, ICMR guidelines begin by explaining what is meant by these terms and how they get reflected in the research elements. Okay. So general ethical issues. Guidelines speak about benefit risk assessment, the importance of privacy and confidentiality, payment for participation. Do you think it is ethical to pay a research participant? Why? Do you get paid when you are going as an examiner? So you don't mind taking that payment. You are getting your salary. So there could be legitimate expenses. T&DA, a person who is a daily wage earner may be losing wages if they come to visit your hospital for the purpose of fulfilling your demands of research. So TA and DA are always acceptable. Over and above, some incentive for participation is also acceptable, but the spirit is that the incentive amount should not be such that it becomes an indirect coercion for research. I come to the research not for benefit but for the money. Okay. আমি একটা লোককে যদি বলি যে আপনি এলে 5,000 টাকা করে পাবেন, তাহলে he will suspend all his other judgment and will keep coming. So it is the responsibility of the ethics committee to decide how much is ethical considering the circumstances of the case. So payment for participation is per se not unethical, but you have to be on guard regarding how it is implemented. Ancillary care, vulnerable groups, post-research access, we'll be speaking a little bit about them. Informed consent process, distributive justice, Shaptoshi has spoken about it. Compensation for harm, we have spoken about it. Conflict of interest, already covered. Community engagement. Now, what do you mean by vulnerable groups in research? Okay. Pregnant mother, lactating mother, children, specially abled or differently abled. These are examples of vulnerable groups in this. Sorry, tribal populations. So these are examples of vulnerable groups. So what is the common thread? Common thread is, what word did you use, sir? Exploitation. So they are vulnerable to exploitation for the purpose of research. So any group of participants who by dint of their age, gender, socioeconomic circumstances or clinical circumstances may not be able to exercise full autonomy, may not be in a position to take the best decisions by themselves. They will be considered vulnerable. And the examples we have already stated. But what you have not stated, one important example you have missed out. Can you guess? Look at the last three. Prisoners, army personnel, students, subordinates, employees. What is common to them? They are in a hierarchical structure under command. So even faculty in a medical college is vulnerable. Principal will say a notice, hey, trial হচ্ছে, সব faculty participate করবে। spread that the red label syringes was poison. See what the parents of those who are supposed to get the red label syringes vaccine, the kind of reception they gave to the vaccinating person. So this should not be done. So what is done is now the design of these studies are changed. Instead of doing randomized control studies, you do cluster randomized studies. So instead of randomizing children in villages to the 2 study arms, you randomize villages to the study arm. So all the children in one village gets yellow and all the children in another village gets red. So these are some of the special considerations in public health research, and the guidelines talk about them. Appropriate measures for data security and confidentiality of information. So today's newspaper, there is a thing that huge Aadhaar data breach from the archives of Indian Council of Medical Research. All that is being debated today. Biological materials and biobanking. Biological materials may be prospectively collected or may be left over from earlier studies or clinical services. This could include biological fluids, dried blood spots, tissue samples, even organ samples. Okay. Data sets are collections of health data in disease registers, surveys, surveillance, census, bedhead tickets. Okay. So research with them so that privacy and confidentiality of the participants is respected. They should be done in what is called an anonymous or anonymized manner. If you want to do it in identifiable manner, then you need explicit informed consent. If you feel that it would be difficult to get informed consent because these samples have already been collected and the donors have gone off, then either you'll have to deal with them in an anonymous manner or in an anonymized manner. So what is this anonymous or anonymized? What's the difference? So samples may be identified, unidentified, or de-identified. So what's the difference between unidentified and de-identified? Okay. So suppose you want to do some study with bones in anatomy. You go to the anatomy department, they have a collection of 50 skulls. And they do not know who's the source of, who are the, from which cadavers or which bodies or which individuals. So they are already unidentified. No problem with it. But you go to pathology, you want to do with archive samples. Tissue blocks are there, but they are identifiable. They are linked to patient registry numbers, registration numbers. So you can trace back and find whom they belong to. So you approach, you take administrative approval, and the MSVP or principal may say, okay, the pathology department can hand over the samples, but they have to anonymize them, de-identify them. So they remove the original registration numbers and give it to them, or they may ascribe new codes to it if they feel that it is important to retain the link. So they speak about in details about these things, anonymizing the samples, anonymous samples, etc. Ethical dilemmas can arise over issues such as ownership of samples or data, custodianship, transfer of biospecimens. You collect specimens in one institute, then another institute requests for research, you hand over to them. So your patients had given to your institute, they were not told that they were going to be handed over to another institute. So these issues may be important, and respecting ethnic identity and confidentiality is important in population-based studies of stigmatizing diseases. Okay. So these are some of the issues dealt with by the ICMR guidelines. Okay. And the latest addition is that, unlike in a blood bank, or a blood center, they are calling it nowadays. A donor has the right to ask for destruction or withdrawal of collected samples which have been donated for the purpose of research. Blood donation কি হয়? Once you have donated the blood, আমরা কি ফোন করে বলতে পারি এই আমার ব্লাডটা কাউকে দেবেন না, ফেলে দিন? That is not acceptable under Indian blood banking guidelines. But ICMR has given this privilege to research participants that even if they had initially donated samples for research, they still retain the right to ask for those samples not to be used. Okay. So all of them, all of these issues came from the story of Henrietta Lacks. Have you heard about Henrietta Lacks? Have you heard of the HeLa cells? The HeLa cell line is, the name is coming from Henrietta Lacks. Henrietta Lacks was an American woman, black American woman. She died of ovarian cancer. Okay. In the hospital in which she died, her tissue specimens were stored, the ovarian cancer specimens were stored, and they were used to generate this HeLa cell line, which is an immortal cell line, which you can use for many different types of cancer research. But when they were used, they were even commercially exploited. Henrietta Lacks' family's permission was never taken. So this evolved into snowballed into a major issue. The family was offered a lot of money, but eventually they refused to accept the money, saying that it's going ultimately for the benefit of humankind because of an immortal cell line. So from these issues, these issues of custodianship, etc., arose, and these were not previously addressed in the ICMR, earlier versions of the ICMR guidelines, but these are again being addressed. And if you want to say, nowadays, if you send samples from India to outside, you have to take permission from the Ministry of Department of Health Research. Under the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, there are what is called material transfer agreements to be signed between the parties for all this confidentiality and rights issues. Research in emergency disasters. Okay. The COVID pandemic has taught us many things about the need for research in difficult circumstances and how they should be done. And the ICMR guidelines specify some of these elements. So preemptive research preparation, they can be done in advance of future emergency or disaster situations, and efforts should be made to protect identifying information about individuals and communities to prevent stigmatization, ostracization, and exploitation by print and visual media, which we faced in the COVID times, not only regarding COVID cases, but initial COVID vaccine recipients, etc. So what ICMR has done, the ICMR Biomethics Unit, which is based out of Bengaluru, they produced a number of short videos, okay, on a number of topics on clinical research ethics. And this is a selection of the videos they have. You can just go to YouTube and search for ICMR Bioethics videos, and you'll get a lot of videos. They are not very long, half an hour to 45 minutes, each one of them, but they beautifully illustrate many of the concepts which ICMR has put into its document and many of the dilemmas which we faced. So this part is over. Now we'll go into new drugs and clinical trial rules. I'd like to change over slideshow. Do we need to end the slideshow? Any questions on this? So my request is you have to do a homework of reading through 22 pages of the ICMR handbook 2018.